Marcus Chen, a former concert violinist turned billionaire tech entrepreneur, works anonymously as a night security guard at Lincoln Center to reconnect with the music world he left behind after a traumatic accident. When he discovers a young street musician's broken violin and repairs it with his hidden expertise, his extraordinary performance reveals his true identity, forcing him to confront his past and rediscover his passion for music. The autumn wind swept through the streets of Manhattan's Upper West Side, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of late-night traffic. At 11:47 p.m., Lincoln Center stood like a majestic fortress of culture, its iconic buildings bathed in warm golden light that contrasted sharply with the darkening October sky. The fountain at the center of the plaza had been turned off for the night, leaving only the gentle echo of footsteps from the few remaining pedestrians making their way home. Marcus Chen adjusted his security uniform and checked his watch as he began his nightly rounds. To anyone passing by, he appeared to be just another middle-aged security guard, unremarkable, invisible, part of the city's vast network of night workers who kept things running while the world slept. His dark hair, now touched with gray at the temples, was neatly combed back, and his brown eyes held a depth that suggested experiences far beyond what his current occupation might imply. What no one knew, not his supervisor, not his colleagues, not even the cleaning staff who greeted him with friendly nods, was that Marcus Chen was worth approximately $2.3 billion. His tech company, Neural Sync Technologies, had revolutionized artificial intelligence interfaces and made him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. Yet here he was, walking the halls of Lincoln Center at midnight, earning $18 an hour plus benefits. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as the visionary who changed everything. Tonight, he was checking door locks and monitoring security cameras in a building dedicated to the one thing he had loved more than technology, more than money, more than anything else in the world: music. Marcus pushed open the heavy glass doors leading into David Geffen Hall, home of the New York Philharmonic. The lobby was dimly lit, with only the emergency lighting casting long shadows across the marble floors. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way past the donor recognition walls, where brass plaques honored the generous supporters of the arts. If they only knew, he thought wryly, that someone who could fund an entire wing of the building was walking among them in a security uniform. He had started this job 8 months ago, using a carefully constructed background that showed him as Marcus Williams, a former warehouse supervisor from Queens who needed steady work with good benefits. The background check had been flawless. His team of lawyers and identity specialists had seen to that. He needed this anonymity, this connection to the world he had abandoned, this chance to be near music again, without the crushing weight of expectations and memories. As he climbed the stairs to the second level, Marcus passed the photographs lining the walls. Legendary conductors, world-renowned soloists, and celebrated orchestras that had graced these stages. His eyes lingered for a moment on a photograph from 2018, showing a young Asian-American violinist mid-performance, bow raised, face transformed by the passion of Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The nameplate read, Marcus Chen, guest soloist with the New York Philharmonic. That had been his last performance. 3 days later, the accident had changed everything. Marcus continued his rounds, checking the practice rooms, the administrative offices, and the storage areas where instruments and sheet music were kept. The building felt alive even in its silence, as if the walls themselves held the memory of every note that had ever been played within them. Sometimes, late at night like this, he could almost hear the phantom echoes of symphonies past. It was during his patrol of the basement level that he heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Soft, muffled sobs coming from somewhere near the loading dock. Marcus immediately shifted into professional mode, his hand moving instinctively to his radio, but as he approached the source of the sound, following the building's safety protocols, what he discovered made him pause. Sitting on a concrete ledge near the service entrance was a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and clothes that suggested she didn't have much money. More importantly, she was holding a violin, or what remained of one. The instrument's neck was cracked, one of the strings had snapped, and the bridge had partially collapsed. "Miss, you can't be here," Marcus said gently, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but also a warmth that came from recognizing a fellow musician in distress. "This is a restricted area." The woman looked up, startled. Her green eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and she clutched the damaged violin protectively against her chest. I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go. I was playing in the subway and some drunk guy, he knocked into me and she gestured helplessly at the broken instrument. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He recognized the look in her eyes, the devastation of a musician whose instrument, their voice, their very soul, had been damaged. It was a pain he understood all too well. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone softer now. Sarah Mitchell." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I saw this place and I needed to be somewhere where music mattered, you know? Even if I can't play anymore." Marcus studied the broken violin more carefully. It wasn't an expensive instrument, probably a student model worth a few $100s, but he could see that it had been well cared for. The wood was polished, the strings had been recently changed, and there were small wear marks where her fingers had pressed against the fingerboard, evidence of countless hours of practice. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. "Since I was 7. 15 years. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "It's all I know how to do. I dropped out of Juilliard 2 years ago because I couldn't afford it. And now this." Marcus stared at the broken violin in Sarah's hands, and for a moment, he was transported back 15 years to his own student days at the New England Conservatory. He remembered the terror he'd felt when his first decent violin had been damaged in a fall down his apartment stairs, the same look of devastation that now clouded Sarah's face. "May I take a look at it?" he asked, extending his hands carefully. Sarah hesitated, then slowly handed over the instrument. The moment Marcus's fingers touched the wood, something awakened in him that had been dormant for 3 years. His hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades working with violins, not just playing them, but understanding every aspect of their construction and repair. "The neck crack isn't as bad as it looks," he said, examining the damage under the dim loading dock lights. "The bridge can be repositioned, and this string," he held up the snapped E string, feeling its tension, "this can be replaced. The soundpost might have shifted, but that's fixable too." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You know about violin repair?" Marcus caught himself, realizing he'd revealed more expertise than a typical security guard should possess. I used to work at a music shop, long time ago." It wasn't entirely a lie. During his teenage years, he had spent countless hours in old Giuseppe Toretti's violin shop in Boston's North End, learning the ancient art of instrument repair from a master craftsman who had trained in Italy. "Do you think it can be fixed?" Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice. Marcus nodded slowly. "It needs proper tools and materials, but yes, definitely." He looked around the loading dock, then made a decision that surprised even him. "Wait here." He returned 10 minutes later, carrying a small toolkit that he'd retrieved from the building's maintenance department, along with some supplies he'd found in the music storage room. Sarah watched in amazement as he laid out tiny clamps, wood glue, spare strings, and other repair materials on a clean cloth. "Where did you get all this?" she asked. "Lincoln Center keeps repair supplies for emergencies," Marcus explained, which was partially true. What he didn't mention was that he'd also used his security access to retrieve some professional-grade materials from a locked cabinet that most guards wouldn't even know existed. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading dock, Marcus began to work. His movements were precise, methodical, almost surgical in their care. He started by carefully cleaning the crack in the neck, removing tiny splinters of wood and debris. Sarah sat mesmerized as he applied a thin line of hide glue along the fracture with the skill of a master craftsman. "You have to let the wood fibers align naturally," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Giuseppe always said that rushing a repair is like trying to heal a broken heart. You can't force it. You can only create the right conditions and let time do its work." "Giuseppe?" Sarah asked. Marcus paused, realizing he'd spoken aloud again. "An old violin maker I knew. He taught me that every instrument has its own personality, its own voice. When something breaks, you're not just fixing wood and metal. You're healing something that was meant to sing." As he worked, Sarah found herself studying this enigmatic security guard more carefully. His hands moved with a confidence that spoke of years of experience, and the way he handled her violin suggested an intimate knowledge of the instrument that went far beyond casual hobbyist level. There was something almost reverent in the way he touched the wood, as if he were reconnecting with an old friend. "What made you stop?" she asked quietly. "Working with violins, I mean." Marcus's hands stilled for a moment. The simple question opened a door he'd kept tightly locked for 3 years. "Sometimes life takes you in different directions," he said finally, resuming his work on the bridge adjustment. "Sometimes you have to walk away from the things you love most." The bridge repositioning required delicate work. Marcus used a small knife to carefully adjust the bridge's position, checking the angle and height with the practiced eye of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Sarah watched as he tested the tension, making minute adjustments that most people wouldn't even notice. "The soundpost is definitely shifted," he said, peering through the F-hole with a small flashlight. "That's what's going to affect your tone the most." Using a specialized tool that he'd found in the repair kit, he carefully maneuvered the small wooden post back into its proper position inside the violin's body. As he worked, Sarah began to share her story. She'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a part-time librarian. Music had been her escape, her way of dreaming beyond the limitations of her circumstances. When she'd been accepted to Juilliard, it had felt like a miracle until the reality of New York's cost of living had made continuing impossible. "I've been playing in subway stations for 2 years now," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "It's not much, but it keeps me connected to music. Some days I make enough for rent and groceries, other days..." She gestured at her worn clothing. Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest. Here was someone who loved music with the same pure passion he'd once felt, someone for whom the violin wasn't just an instrument, but a lifeline to something greater than themselves. He remembered that feeling, the way music could transform the ordinary world into something transcendent, the way a perfectly played phrase could make time stop and hearts soar. "Where do you perform?" he asked, as he began replacing the broken string. "Usually at the 72nd Street station, sometimes Times Square if I'm feeling brave." Sarah managed a small smile. "The acoustics aren't great, but people are generous when the music moves them. There's this one businessman who stops every Tuesday morning on his way to work. He never says anything, just drops a 20 in my case, and nods. I think maybe he played once too." Marcus's hands moved with increasing fluency as he fine-tuned the string tension and made final adjustments to the violin's setup. The familiar motions awakened muscle memory that had been sleeping for years, and for the first time since the accident, he felt the absence of his own violin like a physical pain. The final string adjustment took Marcus another 20 minutes of meticulous work. As he tuned the violin, the loading dock filled with the sweet, pure sounds of the instrument coming back to life. Each note he played to test the tuning resonated clearly in the concrete space, and Sarah's eyes widened with amazement as she heard her violin singing again. It sounds better than before," she whispered, unable to hide her astonishment. Marcus handed the instrument back to her, but his fingers lingered on the neck for just a moment longer than necessary. The repair actually improved the resonance slightly. Sometimes a small trauma, when properly healed, can make something stronger than it was originally. Sarah took the violin reverently, testing the strings with gentle plucks. The sound was rich and warm, with a clarity she'd never heard from her instrument before. "I don't know how to thank you. This must have taken you hours, and I can't really pay you for the work." "You don't need to pay me," Marcus said, beginning to pack away the tools. Just play something. Let me hear how it sounds." Sarah positioned the violin under her chin and drew the bow across the strings experimentally. The sound that emerged was pure and sweet, filling the utilitarian space with sudden beauty. She began with a simple scale, testing each string, then gradually moved into a piece Marcus recognized immediately, Bach's Air on the G string, one of the most hauntingly beautiful melodies ever written. As Sarah played, Marcus felt something breaking open inside his chest. The music transported him back to concert halls filled with breathless audiences, to moments when time seemed to stop, and the entire world existed only in the space between bow and string. Her technique was good, not perfect, but passionate and sincere. She played with the kind of emotional honesty that couldn't be taught, only felt. But as beautiful as her playing was, Marcus found himself imagining how the piece could soar with more sophisticated bowing techniques, with the subtle dynamic variations that could make the melody breathe like a living thing. His fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory responding to music after 3 years of silence. When Sarah finished, she lowered the violin with tears in her eyes. "Hey, it's been so long since I could play properly. The old strings were so dead, and the bridge was starting to warp even before tonight." "You have a gift," Marcus said quietly. "Your intonation is excellent, and you play with real feeling. That's rarer than perfect technique." Sarah looked at him curiously. "You really did more than just work in a music shop, didn't you? The way you listen, the way you talk about music, it's like you understand it from the inside." Marcus felt the weight of his secret pressing against his chest. For 3 years, He'd carried his identity like a burden, the knowledge of who he'd been and what he'd lost, eating away at him in the silence of his self-imposed exile. But standing here in this loading dock, watching this young woman's joy at being reunited with her voice, he felt something shifting. "I used to play," he admitted. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Sarah asked gently. "Why did you stop?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the violin in her hands. "There was an accident. My left hand was damaged. The doctors said I'd never play professionally again." It was the truth, though not the whole truth. The accident had damaged more than just his hand. It had shattered his confidence, his identity, his belief in his own worth beyond his musical ability. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and Marcus could hear the genuine empathy in her voice. "That must have been devastating." It was. "Music was everything to me. When I lost it," he trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "But that's not important now. What matters is that your violin is fixed, and you can keep playing." Sarah studied his face in the dim light. Something in his expression, in the way he'd spoken about music, made her suspect there was much more to his story. On impulse, she held out the violin to him. Would you like to try playing something, just to make sure the repair is really solid?" Marcus stared at the offered instrument as if it were a dangerous animal. His left hand, the one that had been crushed in the car accident 3 years ago, began to throb with phantom pain. The doctors had repaired the damage well enough for normal function, but the precise finger movements required for professional violin playing had been lost, or so he'd convinced himself. "I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please," Sarah said softly. "I can see it in your eyes. The music is still there, isn't it? It's still calling to you." Marcus looked up at her, seeing understanding in her green eyes that went beyond words. Here was someone who truly comprehended what music meant, what it cost to love it so deeply that losing it felt like losing a limb. Slowly, with hands that trembled slightly, he reached for the violin. The moment the instrument settled under his chin, Marcus felt a recognition so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. The familiar weight, the smooth wood against his neck, the way the violin seemed to become an extension of his body. It all came flooding back with overwhelming intensity. He raised the bow, hesitated for just a moment, then began to play. The first notes were tentative, careful, as his damaged left hand remembered its old positions. But as the melody of Pachelbel's canon in D began to emerge, something magical happened. The music took over, and Marcus's body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. His fingers found their positions with increasing confidence. His bow arm moved with the fluid grace of years of training, and the loading dock was transformed into a cathedral of sound. Sarah watched in stunned silence as this security guard, this man who claimed to have once worked in a music shop, played with a technique and musicality that she'd only heard from world-class performers. The way he shaped each phrase, the subtle vibrato, the perfect intonation. This wasn't just someone who used to play. This was a master. As the final notes of Pachelbel's canon faded into the concrete walls of the loading dock, silence settled between them like a living thing. Marcus stood frozen, the violin still positioned under his chin, his eyes closed as if he were afraid to open them and face reality. The music had awakened something in him that he'd thought was buried forever. Not just his technical ability, but the profound joy that came from creating something beautiful, something that could touch the soul. Sarah stared at him in complete shock, her mouth slightly open. What she had just witnessed defied everything she thought she knew about this humble security guard. The performance had been flawless, filled with the kind of nuanced interpretation that came only from years of professional training and natural genius. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus slowly lowered the violin, his hands shaking as he handed it back to her. The weight of his secret felt unbearable now, especially under her searching gaze. For 3 years, he had hidden from the world, convinced that his worth as a human being had died in that hospital room when the doctors told him his concert career was over. "My name is Marcus Chen," he said quietly, the words feeling strange on his lips after months of being Marcus Williams, the security guard. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. Marcus Chen, the violinist? The one who performed with all the major orchestras? But you disappeared. There were rumors about an accident, but no one knew what really happened. Marcus nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Car accident 3 years ago. I was driving home from a late recording session, fell asleep at the wheel. The crash damaged my left hand severely. The surgeons did their best, but they said the fine motor control necessary for professional violin playing would never fully return. But you just played. Sarah gestured helplessly toward the space where the music had filled the air. That was extraordinary. That was perfect. It wasn't perfect, Marcus said with a bitter laugh. I made at least a dozen small errors that would have been career-ending in a concert hall. My vibrato is inconsistent. My shifting isn't as clean as it used to be, and my stamina. He flexed his left hand, feeling the familiar ache in the reconstructed joints. I couldn't play a full recital anymore. Sarah set the violin carefully on the concrete ledge and turned to face him fully. Do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about tiny imperfections that only another professional would even notice. What I just heard was the most beautiful playing I've ever experienced in person. Marcus finally looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her green eyes. You don't understand. When you've performed at Carnegie Hall, when you've been a soloist with the Berlin Philharmonic, when music critics have called you a once-in-a-generation talent, anything less than perfection feels like failure. So you gave up entirely? Sarah's voice carried a note of incredulity. You abandoned music completely because you couldn't be superhuman anymore? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Put so simply, his decision seemed almost absurd. I couldn't face the disappointment, the pity, the reviews that would compare everything I did to what I used to be capable of. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then she picked up her violin again, holding it like the precious thing it was. Do you know why I play in subway stations? Marcus shook his head. Because that's where music lives, she said passionately. Not in concert halls filled with critics and donors and people who think art is about status. In the subway, people stop because something inside them responds to beauty. They drop money in my case not because they're supposed to, but because the music moves them. That businessman I told you about? He stops every Tuesday because for 3 minutes, my playing transforms his commute into something meaningful. She began to play again, this time choosing a simple folk melody that Marcus didn't recognize. But as she played, he could hear everything she meant in the notes themselves, the honesty, the direct emotional connection, the pure love of making music without pretense or expectation. You've been working as a security guard here for months, Sarah continued, lowering the violin again. Why? What were you looking for? Marcus considered the question seriously. I thought I was looking for closure, a way to be near music without having to participate. But tonight, he gestured at the violin, at the tools scattered around them, at the magical transformation that had occurred in this utilitarian space. Tonight I remembered why I fell in love with music in the first place. It wasn't about the applause or the reviews or being called a prodigy. It was about moments like this, when music becomes a bridge between souls. Sarah smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her all evening. So what happens now? Do you go back to being a security guard who pretends he can't play? Do you keep hiding from the thing that obviously still brings you the most joy? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, feeling the pull of old fears warring with the awakening hope in his chest. I don't know if I'm ready to perform publicly again. The pressure, the expectations. Then don't, Sarah said simply. At least not yet. But there are other ways to be involved with music. You could teach, you could mentor young players. You could work with people like me who need guidance and encouragement. She paused, then added with a mischievous glint in her eye, you could even play in subway stations. The image made Marcus laugh despite himself. Billionaire tech entrepreneur Marcus Chen, busking in the 72nd Street station. But as absurd as it sounded, there was something appealing about the idea of returning to music's roots, of playing for people who would listen with their hearts rather than their prejudices. You know, he said slowly, I still have access to practice rooms here, and there are young musicians who come through Lincoln Center's educational programs who could probably use some informal mentoring. Sarah's face lit up. Now you're talking. And maybe sometimes I could practice with you. I could use some help with my technique, and you could use some help remembering why music matters. Marcus looked at this remarkable young woman who had wandered into his life, carrying a broken violin, and somehow managed to help him begin repairing the broken pieces of his own soul. I think that sounds like a beginning.